Hey everyone, this is Christopher Paolini again, and I am here today with the awesome Laura Sebastian. Thank you for being here today.
Thank you for having me. This is really fun. I'm excited.
My pleasure. Now, for those of you who don't know, Laura is a first-time author, and you have your first book coming out this month, isn't that correct?
I do. It comes out April 24th. It's called Ash Princess.
Yes, and full disclosure, now you and I share a publisher. We're both at Random House.
Yes.
And they asked me if I'd be willing to read your book and do an interview with you, and I have to say I thoroughly enjoyed reading your book.
Oh, great.
So it was very easy. It was very easy for me to say, yes, I want to interview you.
Good. It's still so weird for me when people say they've read my book because it's a weird feeling, especially people whose books I've read, and it's very surreal to me still. But I'm so glad you enjoyed it.
It doesn't ever get less surreal, I can tell you that. So for people who haven't read the book yet, which is probably going to be the majority of our viewers today, because this is your first book and it's just coming out, what's it about? Tell us about the story.
It's the forward pitch is that it's my Slytherin Sansa Stark story. And then my slightly longer pitch is that it's about the captive queen of a conquered country who spends 10 years as a living trophy in the enemy's court, waiting for someone to save her. And then something happens and she realizes that she has to save herself and her country.
Very good. And we're probably going to have a few small spoilers in this conversation, but I'll try to avoid any big ones. What was your specific inspiration for writing this book?
I did not really grow up with fantasy. I came to it a little bit later in life. My parents are not big fantasy fans. I didn't really have any friends who were really into it. I think like my gateway drug was kind of Harry Potter, and I kind of moved into it from there. And as much as I loved it, I always knew that if I were in most of these fantasy worlds with all of these like really badass female characters, I would probably not survive the prologue. Because like I can't handle a sword. Like I've never been like the gutsy, brave heroine. And I kind of just always knew that like as much as I loved reading about those heroines, I would not be them. And so I really wanted to write a book about a girl who literally should not survive the prologue, but somehow does, and somehow keeps surviving, even though she's not a brave warrior. She survives with her mind, with her cunning, with her conspiring, and it was a lot of fun to write.
I'm so glad you brought up that point, because that was something that struck me very strongly reading the book, because now the books I'm most known for are your very stereotypical male coming-of-age fantasy story in some ways. And from a mythological and the folklore standpoint, there's very specific things you do with a male coming-of-age story, and you don't do that in this book. It is a coming-of-age story. It is a coming-to-power story, but you don't do it in a way that would be right for a male character. And specifically how your main character, she doesn't wield violence the way a man would.
No. I think she wields it in a more, I think, queenly way where there's a disconnect. There is definitely a lot of violence in the book. There's a lot of violence that happens. Some of it at her order or in her name, and but not at her hand. And yeah, that was definitely a big part of it. And I've always been really fascinated by history and queens in general, because even before Elizabeth, there were a lot of very, very powerful queens that we don't really hear much about. And so I wanted to look at them and look how they ruled, even if they don't get a lot of credit for a lot of the things they do. Empress Theodora comes to mind. She doesn't really get a lot of credit for the stuff she did, but like she did a lot of really great stuff. And so I wanted to write about like a quieter heroine who does a lot, but not in the way that we're used to reading about.
You know, and I think it's important to make the point too that even though your main character, can you say her name again, the full name, just because it's beautiful and I don't want to mispronounce it?
Theodosia.
Just because she's not running around with a sword fighting, I don't want people to think that maybe her story isn't exciting or thrilling or dangerous or any of that, because it certainly is, I think. I think you did a great job of, keeping the pages turning and making it interesting, exciting.
Thanks. Yeah, I think it was all about, the pacing is still, I think, definitely there, and it definitely moves. And the danger is always there, and I think that's definitely a part of it. And I think the key to pacing is that really one scene just always has to inform the next scene. There has to always be that forward drive. You have to end a scene wanting to know what happens next. And unfortunately, the key to that is a lot of times as the author, you can't really know what happens next. I think that kind of comes through a little bit.
There were a couple of times where I almost didn't want to turn the page because I knew something dreadful was going to happen, and I was scared about because I didn't know how far you were going to go. Like you said, there's definitely some violence in the book, but it's not gratuitous, and it's not sadistic in the sense that I didn't feel like you were taking sadistic pleasure in torturing your characters, which some authors do. And
yeah.
I hate that as a reader.
Those scenes were really hard for me to write. I did not set out to write a violent book. I've never really been one for violence in any way, but I think knowing the book that I was writing and the character I was writing and the circumstances that would have to have shaped her, I knew that it was going to have to be a violent book in order to do that justice. So I was really only going as far as I felt was necessary because I really did not want to go further than that. Yeah, it was very hard for me to write, and yeah, so I'm glad it's hard to read because it should be.
I think you did something very well, which Robin Hobb also does well, which is putting your characters in very difficult situations and then watching how they deal with them and how they grow and learn from them. Because sometimes authors, they love their characters and they shy away from putting them in those difficult situations, and then you can see it in the story. It's like, well, your story's good, but you never really went for it. You never really pushed the gas, so to speak.
I think I started writing pretty young. Like 15 or 16, I started just dabbling. I wrote a lot of fan fiction. I wrote a lot of Harry Potter fan fiction specifically. And I enjoyed it and I had fun with it. But I remember looking back at it one day and being like, nothing happens in these stories. These are just nice people hanging out with each other, and their conversations are kind of cool. But nothing ever happens to them. And I think that was something I struggled in my writing with for a while, was that I never really wanted to go there. And I never really wanted to put my characters in harm's way in any significant way. Especially, I think with this book, it's a lot of self-destruction as well that you see. You see the characters making bad choices. And I wanted, which is another thing that I think I always kind of shied away from. Because you want your characters to do the right thing and get there in the end, and sometimes that's not true to reality. I think people have to make a lot of mistakes in order to find the right thing, and so that was definitely an adventure.
How did you learn to do that then, to put them in the difficult situations and all of that?
I think I had a lot to do with reading. I started being very critical of the things I read, and noticing how authors did things that they did, so that definitely helped. And I hated authors for doing those things to the characters, but I understood that they needed to be done in order for the story to be the story. And so once I realized that, and I kind of paid closer attention to that and noticed the different beats and the different arcs that characters had, it became easier to figure out how to implement them in my work.
So I'm sure that a lot of people who are watching this now are, big fans of fantasy, big fans of writing, and are aspiring writers themselves. So how does someone go from being a Harry Potter fan fiction writer to being a published author? How did you make that transition? How did you get there?
It was a long transition. So I finished my first full-size novel at 18. And yeah, you're saying, wow, you definitely finished yours a lot younger than that. But I queried it. I remember this was back when you couldn't email query agents. So I went out and I bought this big book from Barnes & Noble that had all of the different publishers' information, all the agents' information, and I went home and
Writer's Market.
Yeah, Writer's Market. That's what it was.
Writer's Market.
Yeah.
Yeah, I had it too.
It was not a cheap book.
No, I've still got a couple of them on my bookcases.
Yeah, you had to buy a new one every year, and they were $50-$60 per book. I remember I spent my babysitting money on it, and I was so annoyed that it was so expensive. And little did I know if I'd waited a year or two, it would have all been online. But I went through and I marked all the different agents, and I looked up what agents represented authors that I liked, and all of that kind of stuff. And then I sent out all these queries, and I got back all rejections. No one wanted to read even the first 50 pages.
Was it fantasy?
It was. It was not marketable in any sense. It was just me writing something that I wanted to read, and which is great. But again, nothing really happened in the story. It was very Gail Carson Levine fantasy, but definitely for an older audience. And so there's a weird disconnect between the voice and the content, and it was a mess. And I looking back, I realized what a mess it was. But at the time, I thought it was great, and I was like crushed. I had these dreams of like they were going to turn it into a movie, and it was going to hit the New York Times bestseller list, and like I was pretty crushed.
How big of a book was it?
It was a pretty long book. I think it was well over 100,000 words.
Wow.
It was very long. But I started working on something else pretty soon after I started querying, and I think that is the thing that kind of like saved me in that sense, because I always was focused on the next thing, and that was a pattern that I kept doing. As soon as I started querying something, I started working on the next thing. And it was good because it kind of kept me focused on that, and I think it made me driven in that respect. But I think I didn't spend enough time editing, and that was a lesson I learned the hard way going, because I ended up querying 10 books before Ash Princess.
10 books?
10 books.
Wow. Okay, so I have to ask, how fast do you write? I mean, for me, 10 books, I still haven't hit 10 books.
Yeah, I'm a fast drafter. I think because I got in this habit of writing books and not spending a lot of time editing them on my own before showing them to people, I would basically just write it and be like, yeah, it's done, move on to the next thing. And so I had I think probably the fastest I've ever written a book was a month. Probably the longest it's taken me is like a year. And that's while working on other stuff with that one. So I'm a pretty fast drafter. Yeah, they're not always. I mean, they're not great first drafts, but they're decent first steps, I'd say.
So then what's the editing process like for you? If you're producing a fairly rough first draft, how much editing do you have to do?
So it used to be none, and that was my thing. For the longest time, I thought that editing meant just like proofreading things and like looking at things on a sentence structure. So my drafts were like a structural mess. They didn't really make any sense. Like there were whole like huge gaps in the story. Like it didn't look pretty at all. So I kind of got in the habit of I would go through when I finally realized that I needed to edit on a deeper level. I started going through and like looking at the different. I have different. I say this like I have a method for every book, but I have a different method honestly for every book. It kind of depends, but I usually need a hard copy of it. So I have to print out this 4 or 5, sometimes 600 page document, and then I go through and I'll make little index cards, and I'll say this is what happens in this scene, this is why it matters, this is where it's going next, and I'll just kind of look at that, and I'll just take the index cards and I'll lay them out, and I'll look at it and see where the gaps are, because unfortunately, I am an underwriter with my drafts. They are not. I never have to edit things back. I never have to many darlings. I always have to add more darlings in.
So how much preparatory work do you do with plotting a story out before you write the first draft then? Because it sounds like you're doing this kind of a hybrid process where you're doing some of the plotting after the first draft and some before.
I don't do much before. Sometimes I will try, and then as soon as I actually sit down to write, it all leaves me and I just kind of go into it. I do more of I usually, the hardest thing for me to do is find the voice. Once I find the voice, it seems like it all kind of gets easier from there. There's some, like this one, I did a lot of, I kind of came up with the concept, and then as I was writing it, I did research, if that makes sense. Like, I don't usually do a lot of research beforehand, which is probably not great, but I'll do it as I read it, and then it'll work its way in there, either in this draft or, like, the future drafts. I always put together a playlist that usually has a lot to do with it, as bad as that sounds. Like, it usually helps me find the mood. It helps me find the themes, and characters. That's another thing too, because I think characters. My writing is very character driven. I think that's where the focus is. Once I have the characters, everything else kind of follows.
Reading Ash Princess, it definitely felt as if you had a very clear sense of the world you were writing about and the characters and how all the pieces fit together. I felt I don't particularly care about like clothes, but I felt like I knew what the characters were dressing in. I knew what the palace looked like. I knew sort of how the world worked, and that was a really nice thing for me as the reader to go through and have that sense.
Oh, good. Yeah, because I that's what I always worry is my weakest thing is describing things in books. I love characters. Plot is something that I've kind of gone to appreciate more, but I always hate describing rooms. It's like my worst. Like someone will have like an editor be like, "Where are they?" Like they start off in this one I thought they were in like a carriage, and then by the end of the scene they're in like a lake, and I don't know how they got there. And I'm like, oh, I don't know either.
All I can say is the descriptions that you've ended up with in Ash Princess after your editing and your process are perfect. They work great. So there's some really nice lines in there. And honestly, the older I get, the less patience I have for really large, overwrought descriptions of the sort I have been known to write myself, just because you really have to be an extraordinary linguistic prose stylist to make reading a large description worthwhile, I think.
It's tough. I feel like normally when I read those tome-like fantasy books, I tend to skim a lot of the descriptions. And, like, I get it. I understand, like, the appeal of it, and I think they're really gorgeously written, but I think as a reader, I'm just like, okay, but where are the people? Because I think the people have always been where the interest is for me. I come from an acting background, so I have always loved to focus on character. And I think if you know what a character wants, then you're already halfway there in terms of building that story. And so yeah, with this I definitely started with Theo because I thought she's very much she could be a damsel in distress, and I wanted to kind of play with the idea of what a damsel in distress is. And so I wanted to create a character who was helpless in a lot of senses of the word, but was not content to be helpless, if that makes sense. I wanted to find a way to fight anyways. Without
spoiling the story, there is a possibility of power that Theo edges up to she approaches a couple of times in the story, and I kept thinking you were going to go for it at some point. And like the most intense point in the story, I thought she's going to do it. She's going to do it. But you didn't, and it actually made the story a lot more interesting because she didn't do what she could have done in that situation.
Yeah, I think it seemed like the expected thing when I was writing it was that she was going to come into these magical powers, and I think that's a little spoiler. There's magic. There's magic powers that characters, that people get when they spend time in these magical mines. And either they get powers, they spend their time worshiping these gods, and they will either come out of the mines with powers or they will come out of the mines mad. And so I really like that danger of power. Like it's a pretty big chance to take. You come out either blessed or cursed, essentially. And there comes a point pretty early on in the story when Theo starts feeling a affinity with fire. And but with the world building, if people use these gifts or these powers without attaining them through the minds or in a pure way, they're seen as doomed. They basically, what our worlds would be, go to hell. And the thing that's kind of keeping Theo sane is this idea that she's going to one day see her mother again in what they could be after. And so if she uses these powers, she might save herself immediately, but she loses the chance of ever seeing her mother again. And there's also the thought that she'll piss off the gods and then she'll lose her home. Like these gods will be so angry that they'll take it out on her country. And I think that's kind of her mental thinking in that. Whether or not it's true is kind of up to interpretation. There are different characters in the books that believe different things about the gods, because I wanted that religious ambiguity in it. I didn't want it to be a clear-cut yes or no answer. But yeah, in terms of why I didn't want her to reach for the power when she could was because I thought it was the expected thing. I thought I'd read a lot of books that had that kind of storyline to them, where a person feels a call to power and immediately takes it. And so I wanted to write something where they don't, for whatever reason, they don't want to take it. And they find a way to start to succeed without it. And it's been fun playing with that in the future books as well, because it's not something that's going away anytime soon.
Well, I think it makes it more interesting, and it makes Theo a more complex and realistic character in a lot of ways. So let's talk about the next few books. Right before we started this interview, you mentioned you're already into editing on the second novel.
Yeah, we're in copy edit.
This is the first in a trilogy, right?
Mm-hmm, first in a trilogy. The second book is called Lady Smoke. And I'm in copy edits. So I'm just going through now and fixing grammar things, basically. The plot of it, the structure of it is all set. which is nice because now I'm starting to talk to people who've read the book and they're like, I really hope this happens in book 2, and I'm like, I can't fix it anymore, so it's kind of what it is.
So does book 2 have a publication date already?
I don't think it has a set publication date. It should come out about this time next year.
Well, I will definitely be picking up the next 2 books in the series because I'm curious to see what happens to Theo and the other characters and where all of this is going. I'm kind of curious, just on a technical standpoint, how do you go about and actually do your writing? Do you write by hand? Do you write on the computer?
I write on the computer, but when I get to a point where the story is kind of flowing, what I do is I have a notebook and I will write down what I call scene anatomy when I'm not quite sure what comes next. And it'll just have, I'll write down the characters who are in it. I'll write down where they are. I'll write down what just happened. And then I'll write what's going to happen in this scene, and then the most important question, why it happens. Because I think that's what keeps the momentum driving forward. If it's just a bunch of scenes strung together, it doesn't always push the reader to keep turning those pages. I think you need to know why we're moving from this scene to this scene. And and I think writing it by hand, I tried doing it on the computer and I just can't. That's something that I always have to do it by hand. That's my process. It's a little bit of both.
It's interesting. I've talked with a bunch of different authors, and I'd say probably at least 2/3, maybe more of them, do their plotting and their notes by writing by hand. It seems to activate a different part of the brain for some reason.
Yeah, that's what I've heard. I have a friend who writes entirely by hand for like huge chunks of her book. And I don't know how she does it. I'm kind of in awe of it. But like I've seen her notebooks and they're full. And like I myself have never completely filled a notebook. I always get bored like halfway through a notebook, and then I see a really pretty one that I want, and I'm like, oh, I can do a new notebook.
Yeah. Well, I love what you're saying about every scene and character and probably every sentence needing purpose, because I really think that shows in your writing and is one of the most important things for aspiring writers, is to not write anything unless you have a reason for it, unless you can justify it.
Yeah, definitely. And it helps in also avoiding writer's block, I think, because you don't write yourself into these impossible corners. Because I find that normally when I get writer's block, it's because A, I don't know what happens next, or B, the story's on the wrong track. And usually if it's A, I can just solve it by doing the little scene anatomy and figuring out what comes next and why. But if it's the other one, that means I had to go back and figure out where I went wrong. And that involves erasing many, many days of hard work oftentimes, which is never fun.
So you mentioned you had a playlist of music for working on this book. Is that something you would share with people, or any interesting songs there?
Yeah, it's a lot of Florence and the Machine, a lot of Lorde, a lot of Halsey. It's a lot of just like angry women singing really prettily. Is kind of like the overall aesthetic of it.
So wait, you're actually able to listen to songs with lyrics you can understand while you're writing? Yeah,
it doesn't mess with me. I know different authors have different thoughts about that. I have a friend who can't write with any music at all. He just needs like total silence to write. And then I have a lot of friends who can't listen to music with words. I can pretty much write anywhere. I think because so for 5 years I was working as a babysitter. So often it would be after school, but a lot of times, like if the kids were sick or if they had snow days, I was with them all day. So I learned to write under any circumstances. Like I've written in like Dave and Buster's with all the music and like the kids shouting and like the games going off, and I've written in bowling alleys. I've written with the TV on while they're watching TV. So I think I've just had like an immersion lesson in just writing through everything.
Did you read any of the stuff you were writing to the kids you were babysitting?
Oh yeah. The girl I was babysitting for five years was 10 when I started babysitting for her, and she is now almost 15. 4 years. I was with them 4 years. But so she's almost 15 now. So she read a draft of this when she was 12. But the books I wrote before, she was younger for. She was like 10 or 11. And so she was not quite in the YA age range yet. So her parents were like, we don't really want her, with this content and this content. And I was like, that's fair. But my book had that content. But because it was my book, I could go back and edit that out. So I have entire drafts of like kid-friendly versions of my books. But yeah, she's been my reader for quite some time, and her and her brother I dedicated the book to because I wrote a lot of it around them. And she's read it many times at this point. She's read book 2, but he hasn't. And he's very excited to. I've warned him that there is some kissing in it, and he's 11, so he's kind of like, but I told him there's also murder. So he's very torn about whether or not he wants to read it. Kissing, but also murder is a good way of summing up this book.
There's a good blurb for you. Kissing and also murder. Actually, that'd be a good title for a book, Kissing and Murder.
That's exactly. It really just, I think, captures what a lot of people want in books, honestly.
I think so. So, given that you've actually, it's probably kind of weird for you because this is your first book coming out, but as you said, you've written, 10, 11 books before this one gets published.
Yeah.
So in some ways, you're actually a very accomplished, experienced writer at this point. So given that you've written all of these novels, do you find that there's a theme or a feeling or a sort of scene or plot that you keep returning to book after book?
There's a couple things. I really like writing about complicated female friendships. There's a couple of them in this book. Without saying too much, definitely a couple of complicated female friendships. And that's definitely something that I really enjoy. And then also, I have a lot of masquerades, which I think is just a personal preference. I just really like a good masquerade ball. And the third one, and this is more of an image that somehow keeps coming up, are blood-stained ball gowns. I think that's just my personal aesthetic. Give me a good gorgeous flowing ball gown covered in blood, and that's what I want in a book. So all three of those things I think come up in every book.
Well, they're definitely there in Ash Princess, along with magic and castles and intrigue and battles and pretty much everything else you could hope for in a fancy novel, I think.
Good,
although no dragons.
Well, there's dragons that are on the flag, and they on the ship. There's they have a little conversation about whether or not there are real dragons. Maybe to be explored in future books. Who knows?
Actually, I take that back because you have the pirate.
Yeah. Oh yeah, Dragon's Bane, because she's the bane of the dragons. The enemy people are the Calavoxians, who their sigil is a dragon. So she's Dragon's Bane because she really anchors them. There are some dragons. They're not great dragons, but they're there.
So there are dragons. Okay. Now that you're at the position to be almost a published author here, soon to be, what advice would you give yourself or any aspiring author if you could sort of go back in time and talk to yourself?
Probably to just enjoy writing without the pressure, because there's a change that happens when you start writing professionally, where the word, even when you're just drafting and you're just getting down bad words, they don't feel like yours anymore. I always hear my editor's voice in my head and my agent's voice in my head, which is not a bad thing, because they say smart things that end up being good for the book. But I kind of missed it when it was just me in my head, and I could write badly if I wanted to, and it was just me. And also writing without deadlines is really nice. I kind of miss that. But yeah, just enjoy it. Enjoy where you're at. Always have an eye on the future, but don't run there so quickly that you can't appreciate the present.
That is wonderful advice, I think, for everyone, no matter if you're a writer or not.
Thanks. And also just find your people. Publishing is really great. I think YA publishing especially is some of the most wonderful people I've ever met in my life. And just find your people, find your community, and find people that you can reach out to when you're in the middle of a publishing fueled anxiety attack, because those happen a lot, and you need to be able to reach out to someone and see, here's all my crazy, can you deal with it, and have them understand enough to deal with it.
I had a publishing deadline crisis anxiety attack with my second book at one point, and I called up my agent to basically say, this is impossible, I can't do this, there's no way this could be done. He laughed at me. He literally just laughed at me and said, yep, you're right on time. This is exactly on schedule for author freakout number 27. This is...
Yeah.
I was like, darn, am I that predictable?
Yeah, well, writing feels like such a solitary thing for so long that you forget that other people are going through the same solitary thing. So I think talking about it really helps, and realizing that you're not alone in this, that this happens to every writer. And that's also that so much of publishing is completely out of your control, which is a hard thing for me to learn in this process, because I like having control over everything. And I think that's why I preferred writing over acting, because on acting, you have to rely on so many other people. And I didn't like that. You have to like wait to get cast in things. You have to rely on your director and your castmates and everyone to do their job. And with writing, I was just like, oh, I just have to rely on me. I can do my job. And but once you get to the publishing part of it, you have a lot less control. You basically just have control over the book and maybe a few other small things. But there's so much that is completely outside of your control that you have to accept.
Yeah, I agree. But at the same time, you can't obsess over things to the degree that, like you said, worrying about what other people are going to think about your prose or how they're going to react to the sequel to the book, and then you can end up locking up and find it too difficult to be productive because you're concerned about things that are ultimately out of your control.
Oh yeah, definitely. And yeah, it just comes down to just letting everything else go and focusing inward and focusing on the things you can. And I think that's the best thing you can do for your sanity and for your books.
I think that's a wonderful note to end things on. Is there anything else you'd love to tell people who haven't read the book or perhaps who are about to read the book? I
mean, I hope they enjoy it. I think we've kind of covered all of the good hooks in it. And yeah, Slytherin Sansa Stark is kind of my go-to hook. If you like Sansa Stark, but you think she should have more of a Slytherin streak in her, then this is a good book for you.
Awesome. Well, again, thank you so much for talking with me today. This has been a real pleasure.
Yeah, thanks for having me. It's been so much fun to talk, and I'm really excited for people to read the book.
I definitely think they should. I had a blast reading Ash Princess. I recommend everyone goes and checks it out, and maybe we'll talk when the second book comes out.
Oh, I'd love that.
It'd be a lot of fun.
Sounds good.
All right, thanks for watching, everyone. I will see you next time.
Great, thank you.